My conspiracy theory is that it's part of the powers that be that have weaponized our food system to make us believe that we can only ever talk about the good things about food. They do not highlight a lot of the negatives that food has not only caused a lot of poverty, hunger, dispossession of land from a lot of people, but also has created this social hierarchy in many ways through racism, classism, sexism, et cetera, et cetera.
So you make food that makes people uncomfortable.
Jenny Dorsey is a professional chef and food politics scholar and was a regular on the Food Network.
I mean, I did TV shows for a while, hated it. However, they can make you show up so that it benefits their viewership. They might say, so you were upset that, Chef Dean did X, perhaps. And I'll say, yeah, I guess. And they'll be like, no, say you were upset that Chef Dean did X.
Today, Jenny talks about her research in Singapore's food scene.
I have always been very interested in Singaporean hawker centers, but many hawkers are still single stall, still trying to make ends meet in an increasingly expensive, increasingly volatile kind of environment and not receiving a lot of support that they need. One uncle said to me, he's not gonna retire, so his retirement plan was to die. I don't think that's what we want.
So you make food that makes people uncomfortable. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so my whole theory around food, or what I would like people to understand about food, is that food is an incredible thing. It's, I think, as we all heard, this idea of food bringing us together, food bridging differences across cultures, and making sure that we're connected, all that stuff. And that is very much true of food. But as a food academic, as a food researcher, someone who is really interested in food at a identity, meaning-making, kind of sociological level, food is also something that very much divides us. It's very much something that re-entrenches a lot of unequal power dynamics in the world. It's a way that we often learn of this internalized superiority or inferiority of ourselves and other people. There's also a lot of damage that food can do. And so I think it's my conspiracy theory is that it's part of the kind of powers that be that have enacted so much control and really weaponized our food system to make us believe that we can only ever talk about the good things about food. We can only talk about how it's great and it's so rosy, it's so fun to break bread together, all this community building, and not kind of highlight a lot of the negatives, highlight a lot of the ways that food has also not only caused a lot of poverty, hunger, just like dispossession of land from a lot of people, but also has created this kind of social hierarchy in many ways through both racism, classism, sexism, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we be able to hold that tension? How do we be able to understand that food can do the whole spectrum of things? And so one of the things that I want to do as a chef is be able to demonstrate all that through food. So through a good meal, through a meal where you connect with others, you can also talk about the pain and the ostracization that you might have experienced through food, in addition to recognizing that you are building connections now or building relationships now.
Got it. Can you share a little bit more about your journey with food and how you became a chef?
Sure. So when I started, I graduated college with a finance degree, went into management consulting like everyone else in my business school, and I was working in the fashion kind of vertical of my management consulting firm, and it's there I started having like a really negative response or kind of a negative relationship with food. So lots of years of disordered eating, a lot of unhealthy ideas of essentially like internalizing my body as a project that I'm always working on, right? Which is a very common way that we look at our bodies, is that it's something that we need to keep fixing. There's always something wrong with it. You see it, I think, most often in like skincare ads, but you see it in a lot of like weight loss ads, right? It's like we internalize this idea that we're not already good enough as beings. We're not already okay as humans. We're not whole or perfect. It's if I was skinnier, if I was a little more muscular, if I was whatever. And so a lot of my initial early kind of responses to food was always very maladaptive. It was always about trying to essentially use food to control myself, because I had very little control over my life. I had very little control over my professional life, personal life, all of those things. I had very little control over my emotions at that point as well. And so food was kind of the way that I enacted a certain kind of like violent control over myself. So that perhaps ironically led me to wanting to cook more. I had always been super fascinated by food. I'm the person that essentially will plan my entire life around eating. One of my early childhood memories that my mom likes to tell me, I don't totally remember this, but when I was 10, we took a family vacation to Las Vegas, and apparently I had planned this itinerary. We would go to like 6 buffets in one day. You know, I had no concept of money. So I was like, we would go and eat all these things. And mom was like, you cannot. There's no way you're going to be able to eat so much. So I always loved food, but also I hated food. And so when I started going to culinary school, that really was a reinvention of like, how am I supposed to relate to food? How am I supposed to relate to myself and my body? And being a chef, being a career changer into the food industry, also learned a lot about what it means to be in an industry where often you have a lot of misfits, you have a lot of career changers, you're in a scene as a blue collar worker where often, especially where I came from a white collar management consulting job, you're really looked down upon. And what does it mean that we have such a substandard view of the people that are literally feeding us, that are literally doing essential work in our societies that we cannot function without, and yet we not only pay them very poorly, but we also constantly kind of not only insult their intelligence, but insult their what they offer to us as a society as a whole. And so it kind of brought up a lot of these existential questions for me that I am still unraveling today.
I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that pivot, that career pivot, because I think that's so brave of you to go through that, because I mean, we're both, coming from an immigrant background, and we grew up in that very similar, you're either an engineer, doctor, or a lawyer, or a failure kind of mindset, right? And so I know you got into business school and you were attending when you decided to make that career pivot. So can you kind of share about what you were going through, and share some words of advice for people who are also thinking about doing a career pivot?
Sure. So my thing that I've said to so many people over the years who have reached out and asked, hey, should I do this career pivot, is it's only ever going to get harder to pivot. It's never going to get easier than what it is right now. So if you think it's hard right now, it's only going to get worse. And I don't mean that in such a negative way, but it's just that there's never going to be a right time. And I had another chef say this to me, and I found it really meaningful, is that there's never going to be, some Saturday morning you wake up and all the stars align and it's like, you should pivot today. It's always going to be, what about the next promotion? What about more stability next year? What about X, Y, and Z thing that I need to pay for? There's always going to be a thing that you're going to think that you need to check off before you can make that pivot. And a lot of that, I do think, it is very real structural obstacles, especially as immigrants, that you're responsible for, especially as women of color, that we're disproportionately responsible for, which we can maybe talk about later. But also part of that is anxiety, a fear of change, and knowing that you have, especially if you're in a corporate career, you have a ladder to climb versus having no idea what you're supposed to be doing is incredibly daunting. So yeah, again, I think the short version is, it's only going to get harder, so the time is now. The time is always now. I think one of the things that I have learned as a career changer is that your career ends up being very nonlinear, and you can't really plan for it to be perfect. And I think I really put a lot of pressure on myself to be like, okay, now that I've gone to culinary school, I'm going to do this and this and this and this and this and this, and then I'm going to be successful. Yeah, if there's something that I really learned from changing careers is that you might have changed careers, but often your mentality has not actually changed that much. And so even though I'm like, I am in a way defying the idea of what many of my peers as well as my parents thought as successful, so I was no longer pursuing, a consulting career or a corporate career. I still had this idea of I'm going to do this after culinary school, and then I'll be successful. I still had actually a very rigid idea of what success meant. I still hadn't really broken free of this kind of constraints that often is ingrained in us because of capitalism and corporate America and all that I had to be constant, this one version of productive in order to be valuable. And so I still definitely fall prey to that. So I think that process is actually much harder as part of the career change than perhaps the actual jumping into a new industry.
I can definitely understand that. I think when you put a lot of type A students who've always been, top of their class, excelling, and you kind of funnel them through the education system, and then they graduate and they're like, well, which school should I go to? And so it's like, I'll tell you which school. Society will tell you which schools to go to, the Ivy Leagues.
There's
or the
only
number
a few
one.
schools. Yeah.
school in your area, and so you go there, and then you have all these career recruiters coming down to your campus and being like, oh, you want to be the cream of the crop of this selected pool. You should be a management consultant or investment banker or whatnot, or going to business school, which I know you said you were the youngest in your batch at Columbia Business School. And so again, and it feels, I mean, if you take a step back, it's like, okay, all these type A students are just collecting accolades here and there. Yeah. But otherwise, there is no benchmark, right? And exactly like you said, we are so ingrained with having benchmarks with both our peers as well as within our career that we start creating them within ourselves, and then we start putting ourselves in a box and we can't even leave. And I thought it was really interesting that you said even when you pivoted into being a chef, with all of the societal implications of that, blue collar as opposed to white collar from before, you still were creating that box, and replicating that box and creating those benchmarks for yourself. And that is tough.
It's essentially a constant journey in looking to others for validation, because that's what society would prefer you to do, because then someone is always there and has enough of an agenda to keep you kind of on this little treadmill. As long as you're always looking to the outside to tell you that you are enough or that you are worthy, there's always going to be something that can be orchestrated for you to do. Or if you run out of perhaps accolades, there's so many people I'm sure that we can all think of that have so much, have so much success behind them and they're unhappy. And so then they often turn to, maybe, okay, if it's not like an addiction like drugs or alcohol, it's probably consumption. There's always something more for you to consume. And the way that consumption marketing works for across all brands is really selling us this idea that if you have this thing, then you'll be happy. It's the same kind of like overall heuristic, right? It's you always need something outside of yourself, or else you'll never be able to feel fulfilled and happy and actualized.
And so how do you plan your career now?
The plan is loose. I do a lot of what I call horizontal thinking, which is where I lie in bed and think. So I am horizontal, and often it leads to some napping. But I really just try to see what makes me feel fulfilled. Obviously, it's a privilege in that I do also have jobs that I have to do, but I have worked from home for a long time. I run a nonprofit, which I can talk about. I have had the luxury of being able to mostly define what I want to do and be able to kind of shape that in a way that feels aligned with my values. So my nonprofit definitely operates kind of in a, what is the right word for it, a slightly precarious state all the time, because we don't take funding from kind of the big grants. We refuse to kind of get money from the big philanthropists. We do want to, so that we're not burdened by their kind of agendas, but that means that we get less money every year, so then we're stressed and a little cash strapped all the time. So it has kind of been a dance my entire career of how much money can I get doing things that don't compromise or compromise as little of my values as possible, while being able to try and do things that I do find fulfilling. So I'm working on a book right now that I have wanted to write for a long time, and literally could not find an agent interested in it for years, and have finally found one. And that just took a really long time of just keeping at it and staying true to it. And now there is someone who cares enough about the idea. So yeah, and that I didn't think that would happen. I didn't know it would happen this year. So sometimes it is also just hoping that it will occur, allowing it to take as much time as it will take.
Wow, got it. I mean, I think you're being very humble by the way that you say it, but I think what you're saying is very approachable, because I think if anyone were to look at your website, and I've linked it in the show notes, but if anyone were to look at your website or your personal brand online, you've built up both a following and as well as a unique voice. And I think someone who hasn't had this conversation with you would look at that and be like, oh, she seems so self-assured. It seems like she's going on this linear path towards realizing whatever she wants. And I think that you kind of breaking it down and being it's more of an internal process where you're kind of reaching for things that feel authentic to you is very cool.
And sometimes I start doing things that I actually don't enjoy and I didn't realize I didn't enjoy. And I think giving myself the grace of okay, I don't love that I did that, and I should stop doing it. I mean, I did TV shows for a while, hated it. And unfortunately, there's going to be people that are only going to know me through how I showed up on those shows, which is, there's nothing I can do about that. But I am proud of the fact that I was able to be like, oh, I feel exploited. Something in me does not feel good. And it doesn't matter what I'm getting out of these shows. Like, I just need to stop doing it. Yeah. And that is, I think, ultimately what I feel incredibly privileged to be able to do, is to be able to step back from things that feel really, really misaligned.
But it's scary though. I mean, just like hearing it I'm 25 now, and I am looking around and I see most of my friends and I are like desperately gripping onto whatever ranks, whatever like accolades or whatnot, or a lot of us are like, we're just going to go to grad school,
That's always a good option.
And so like it feels like after that like structured way of thinking and the way that you've like kind of rose through education, you're now like left in this big blue sea to try to make something out of yourself. And I think you've really carved a very unique career path, as well as a unique career for yourself, by looking internally instead of following what everyone else is doing.
I think what's really hard about that is even the most self-assured, I mean, I've had years of, I guess, moving through this and kind of like having existential crisis every quarter, is that many times as you're starting to build your own kind of North Star for yourself internally, as you're starting to try out that path, as you're starting to tell yourself like, I am worthwhile and I know what I'm doing and I know what my values are, is that often, kind of like Newton's third law, right? Every action has a reaction. Often that is when you'll get the biggest, nastiest, most unpleasant reactions from your external, atmosphere, whether that's peers or friends or family or whoever it is, professional, colleagues, whatever. Because a lot of times when people start seeing you do that, what comes out in them isn't actually support, I hate to say it, it's envy that they haven't processed, and people are actually quite nasty to you about it. And so I think at the beginning, it's like you're working so hard trying to really care for yourself and allow yourself to live in the way that's authentic to you, and you're receiving all that backlash, and that's the hardest time because it's the easiest time to quit. It's the easiest time to be like, oh, I'm getting really negative pushback, I must be doing something wrong. People are dismissive of my wants and needs, my wants and needs must be wrong, as opposed to, wow, that is what they're internalized, what they are, that's their own maladaptive coping, like I'm figuring out what I need and that's all that matters, right? It's very hard to somehow decide that your feelings are important and more important than what other people are projecting onto you.
Right. Can you give us a specific reaction and how you responded to that?
So when I first started culinary school, it was in between so I had applied early decision to Columbia Business School, because similar to you, I was like, I don't know what to do. I'll go to grad school. So I applied early decision to business school, and I had gotten in like December. And school didn't actually start until August of the next year. So I essentially had some time. And in like a whim, I was like, you know what, I'm just going to go to culinary school. I had been taking all these classes, but I actually had not done any like serious cooking. And I wanted a diploma. I wanted kind of the credentials because, again, even though now I often tell people like, don't go to culinary school, it's such a waste of money, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, it's such an indoctrination, yada, yada. At the time, I was very much like, I need this on my resume. Like, it'll make me important. So I went to culinary school, and I started, like, as much as I have a lot of feelings about culinary school and this kind of hierarchy of cuisine and gastronomy that they are constantly pummeling into your brain, that the French is the best and everything, that's a huge problem and the erasure of a lot of cuisine, so we can talk about that perhaps separately. What I really fell in love with in culinary school was the community. I loved the team of people that I was in my kitchen. We were all career changers because I was in the evening class. I would go after work. And I started in that process that I just talked about. I started realizing like, wow, a lot of the values that I had before of caring if I wanted to be friends with someone by looking at their LinkedIn, like those are actually, that's not who I am. That's not what I want to be. When I saw my, culinary school peers really taking care of me and working together, I started realizing things about myself and how I had approached the world that I was like, wow, these are really faulty. These are like not a way to live. And I started saying that to my friend group. I had a college chat with a lot of my friends. I started saying that at work, and people were very nasty. Like, I am not friends with any of those people from that time of my life, except for like maybe two. because everybody was in their dead-end jobs that they hated, and they didn't, that sounds so, I really do believe in humanity, and I think people are inherently very good and all that. This sounds very negative, but I do think that often when we haven't figured out how to manage our own feelings and emotions, we project them, we spew them onto other people. And sometimes when we're like, wow, this other person is actually starting to figure out who they are and be happy with who they are, we're not super supportive of that. And that's what I got a lot of weird or passive aggressive. I'm from Seattle, so everyone's passive aggressive. I went to school in Seattle. So passive aggressive texts, passive aggressive emails, passive aggressive visitors.
What would they say?
It was nothing like you're doing anything wrong. It was just it's an interesting, what are you going to do with that? Or that's an interesting idea to do. Or, well, that was quite expensive that you invested in culinary school, or just kind of underhanded things. Or when I talked about this person that I'm in school with who had a totally different background, might have been in the military, had a kid, or, different ideas of success. They're like, ugh, well, why would they want to, why would you want to spend time with them? Ugh, what can you learn from them? That's why would you do that? There was an idea of there's only a certain kind of class of people that are worthy of you spending your time, attention, caring about, that you could learn from or have something to teach you, which I think is very, very untrue. So a lot of that kind of underhanded toxicity, you can, even if it's not as explicit as what you might experience perhaps in high school, you can feel it permeate, right? Through your life. When I come back from culinary school at night, even though I'm really tired, I'm feeling really excited, and I give an update to my friends and they're not excited about it. The group chat is so lukewarm, you can tell. And it took a lot of soul searching for me to realize that's okay, that's on them. I'm doing the right thing, I'm trying my best, and maybe I just need to find new people. This isn't my tribe anymore. This was my tribe. I'm not saying that they were horrible people and never had any fun with them. We had a lot of fun supporting each other through college. We had a lot of fun I went to business school undergrad too. We had a lot of fun, doing our thing, getting our accolades in college, and we have different goals now for ourselves.
You mentioned that you were on TV, on Food Network shows, and that you hated it. So can you expand a little bit more about your time there, and also what was it like to win one of the shows?
So yeah, TV was a mixed bag. I will ultimately be happy that I went on a couple of competition shows, because I would never otherwise know. It has cultivated so much empathy for me. I feel so empathetic towards everyone that's ever been on reality TV, because I now know all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes that producers don't want you to know, that you'll never know unless you've been there, right? And what I really hated about TV is that even though technically this is unscripted television, so there's no, it's not like a plot that is already laid out, right? So it's under this category called unscripted. But everything is, in a way, already scripted, in that they have a part that they want you to play, and whether or not you consent to playing that part is totally irrelevant. So if they want you to be the bitch, if they want you to be the snobby one, they want you to be the whatever, they being the producers, the showrunners, have so much power and control over the editing, over the cutting especially, over the framing of things, that they can have your audience kind of believe who you are regardless of who you actually are. Your TV persona is so divorced from who you are that you don't really have any control over how you're perceived. And sometimes for some people, their persona and who they are pretty close, but for the most part, I would posit, especially for people of color, especially for women of color, it's often kind of relies on the same tropes that we're all quite familiar with, that TV runners, especially I was on Food Network, they're under scripts, or they might be Discovery Now, whatever, they're kind of catering to a certain demographic that already has an idea of you, and instead of challenging that idea, because that's not really in their, why would they do that? That makes people feel uncomfortable and turn off the show. They play right into it. So ways that they can make you seem a certain way. So for example, if you've watched any of the classic competition shows, there's usually the actual competition, and then there's the green room, right, where you're sitting and you're recounting what happened. So they are asking you questions like, what did you think when X happened? And then you'll respond. But if your response isn't what they want, they will either just ask it again, or they will literally make you just say certain things in a way that they can just use the way that they want. So for example, they might say, so you were upset that, Chef Dean did X. Perhaps I wasn't. And I'll say, yeah, like, I guess. And they'll be like, no. Say you were upset that Chef Dean did X. And I'm like, oh, I was like kind of, miffed that he, so you start kind of adapting to what they want. And then if they still can't quite get it the way they want, they'll just make you say certain random out of context words or make certain random out of context facial expressions. And then they can stitch it together however they want.
So they'll just be like, Jenny, look upset. And then Jenny, say X.
Say whatever.
Okay.
And I'm like, whatever. But then think about TV, right? Depending on what is shown before and after I say whatever, you have an idea of what I said whatever to, even though I said whatever to nothing. So all of it is very fabricated. And, depending on, again, how you're kind of an interchangeable widget. However you can show up or however they can make you show up so that it benefits their viewership, so it benefits their numbers, they will do that. So if it is beneficial for the show to make you seem like awesome, then they will make you seem awesome. And if it's not, they won't, right? It's never about you. So part of it is that you don't take it personally, but at the same time, there are very real impacts of what happens, of how you're portrayed on TV. I still get all these like random messages on people who saw me in the last TV show I did was in 2015. I'm not even, our cells completely change over every 7 years. I'm literally like a different person, right? But that's, for many people, has arrested their idea of me to 2015. That's the only person they'll ever know, which sucks, but there's nothing I can do about that. But that's, I think, something you have to be cognizant of, is what you're seeing is like really not the person, and then what you're also kind of getting is an idea that the producers wanted you to have. So applying critical thinking skills while you're engaging in TV watching is critical.
And have you watched your TV shows back?
Yeah, I have watched all of them back, I think. Yes, I have. Yeah, some of them are so cringe. Like, some of them are so cringe. I've said things that were cringe, things that I either didn't mean and said because, you're stressed, you're under pressure, you're also exhausted. All my shows started at 6 a.m. and you have to report there for like hair and makeup and whatever, but you don't start filming until maybe like 9. So by the time you're actually done, so the one show that I've won, I wasn't finished filming until like 8, but I'd started at 6 a.m. So by the time I'm like filming my last interview, I don't know what's happening. You're inside, you don't know what time it is. Like, so there's also just like things that you say that you didn't mean, or maybe you said and you did mean, but got taken out of context. Like, there's so many things that I'm like, oh, right? It is what it is.
No, thanks for sharing. I mean, honestly, that's not surprising.
It preys on, ultimately, like, confirms what we wanted to believe of those people. Yeah. Like, that's what the producers want, is that nobody's watching, for the most part, people are not watching TV to be like, have their views challenged. They're watching TV so that they can feel the way that they see the world is the way the world is, even if that's not true. And a lot of times, especially for mass market reality TV, that's exactly what they're kind of perpetuating.
Right. And I'm just thinking of like the reality TV shows that I watch, and I don't watch that many, but like Love is Blind, or like, The Queer Ultimatum. There was every queer person had their own shtick, and they like stuck by it the entire time.
Like, is that their shtick? Nobody knows. Yeah.
Exactly. And so what brings you to Singapore? You're here to do your Fulbright research. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so Fulbright, if you're not familiar, it's a program that's sponsored by the U.S. State Department. And regardless of what it says on the website, like cross-cultural exchange, blah, blah, it was launched after World War II, and it's very much like a U.S. propaganda program. It's like, send as many Americans to global countries so that we can instill values of American democracy, a.k.a. like, it's not, is it democracy? Is it capitalism? Is it both? Like, whatever.
So you're supposed to represent
that's what I'm doing here.
Democracy here. All right.
Yeah, that's I don't know if Singapore needs more help with like embracing capitalism, but here democracy. So it's it's a kind of a complicated. The program has some complicated roots, I will say. That being said, I've always wanted to live abroad, so it did give me an opportunity to do that, and I have always been very interested in Singaporean hawker centers, which is what I'm researching, because I think it's very different from any other food kind of infrastructure, at least that I have seen in other countries, where the government has taken a very active, a very dedicated, and a very, very, very big role in making sure that the hawker centers remain alive, remain accessible to some swaths of the population, at least, not all. But anyway, all of that I think holistically is just super interesting. I haven't really seen something like that in other countries, so wanted to study that, and this kind of gave me the opportunity to do that. So I'm happy to do that. It's more about kind of finding the right line of looking at the hawker centers critically as well as lovingly, because I do think they're amazing. I think they're so cool. I think they're unseen, at least in this kind of form in other places. I think it's awesome, but then there's, as with everything, there's downsides, there's problems.
And what's the process of your research?
So right now, I had just finished my first 3 months, which was purely lit review and as much informational interviews as possible. So reading everything I can, every single book, every single thing that people said, oh, you should read about hawker centers, I have read, just general kind of understanding the history. One of the things that I will be producing is like a timeline of all the things that have happened government intervention-wise within the hawker centers. So just compiling that research has been, or research of other people has been helpful. And then doing as much like on the ground informational interviews with people that are studied hawker centers, teach about hawker centers, teach about food in Singapore, written about hawker centers, our hawkers, our wet market vendors, just like trying to understand what they think about this enterprise. What do they think, what's their relationship with this institution? Kind of again, getting a sense of what they believe hawker centers really are, what it does for Singapore, and everyone has a different perspective. And so as someone who's a foreigner, as someone who's obviously new to Singapore, I can only absorb so much through reading. Part of it is just everybody has a different lived experience. So trying to honor that. So that's kind of the first phase. This upcoming second phase is going to be more dedicated interviews where I'm going to probably re-interview some of the people I did informational interviews with, but also more focused on getting like a wider swath and more diverse set of different hawkers and different their explicit experiences with various government interventions and kind of where they see the rest of kind of hawker history going, what hawker futures look like. So doing more recorded interviews. A lot of these were more like kind of casual, off the cuff so far. These will be more semi-structured, kind of like actually writing down data, as well as just trying to take, part of this grant is from National Geographic. So also taking portraits of them outside of their hawker center or outside of the hawker stalls. So learning about these people, humanizing them, understanding that they're not just people that work at a hawker center, or they're not just a hawker. They have other interests and they have a whole diverse range of personalities and ideas and whatever orientations around the world that we should be interested in. And we should be able to see these as whole people, not just people that, you know, provide us Thai fun every day or whatever it is. So that's part of the next phase. And then also interviewing some government officials if they'll respond to my emails.
And will this be presented anywhere? Can people look this up once it's done?
Yeah, so the timeline will definitely be public online. I'm hoping that the government maybe might link to it. Who knows? Maybe not. But I'm officially affiliated here with NUS. So everything that I produce digitally will be archived permanently in their libraries. So the timeline will be there. And then I'm kind of debating how to present the portraits and like mini interviews with the hawkers, but probably like digital photo essay sort of format. I think perhaps more like a story for an outlet like Savour or something like that, talking a little bit about kind of the nuances of what it means to create policies for an institution like hawker centers. It is so critical to the identity of a place, but at the same time also serves like a very real purpose around food security, around cost of living, around like, you know, the future of this country.
So how does the Singapore food scene compare to New York's?
What I think is so cool about Singaporean kind of food, which I just don't think is even possible in places like the US because of such extremely high, you know, private controlled real estate prices that make, you know, the price of having a restaurant or any sort of dining establishment so expensive, is that a lot of places you can still go and eat a meal with your family if you're, you know, middle class and above, and you can have, you know, very yummy food in kind of like whatever chill environment, nothing fancy. It's a place that you can gather. It's still, dining out is still so accessible to such a large swath of the middle class in Singapore, which I just don't think is true at all in the States. So it is refreshing to see that. And then one other thing I'll point out spatially in Singapore when it comes to food spaces is I think there is more just the way that I think the government has constructed infrastructure so that more elderly folks can move around in literal space. They can, you know, get on the MRT or they can get on the bus and go to the hawker center or the kopitiam where their friends are. I think it's easier to age with some dignity here in Singapore. And a lot of that does revolve around being able, at least for the more mobile and able-bodied elderly folk who have the means to do so, that they can still go out and still kind of live a semi-independent life and choose the foods that they want to eat and be out in these food spaces and have that kind of third space, right? Which, yeah, I think it's like very heartwarming to see as a younger person. I'm like, oh, like I wouldn't just be a shut-in if I were 65 years old, which honestly, a lot of older Americans, they just sit at home and end up watching Fox News 24/7. And that's how they become incredibly hateful. So,
yeah, you mentioned this point when we first met for coffee, and it made me think about how there's so many older folks around my condo who live in the HDBs, and there are these like void decks in the HDBs, and they just gather every day, and it's very heartwarming to see them just chilling, living,
taking up space.
No, that's a great point. I think for the most part, the Singaporean population has a very rosy outlook about their hawker centers. So I'm curious if you have any response to that.
I think a lot of this kind of rosy idea of hawker centers, it's not unfounded, and a lot of it is true. There's a large swath of people in Singapore who can afford it. The food is very yummy, it's very inexpensive, etc. But I think there's just a lot of like these hidden costs that we're not quite aware of, because the government is obviously they're hidden costs because the government doesn't want us to know that they're costs, right? So a lot of the hawkers are self-employed. If they only have one stall, they're usually self-employed. So that kind of creates issues for their CPFs. Maybe then they're not contributing as much as they must, so that they don't really have a secure retirement. So a lot of times there isn't really much of an option for them except to just keep working. And also because of how the subsidized rents work for certain hawkers that kind of were the originals that came off the street, you're given these licenses where it's kind of pegged to a single person, and you have to be that person working at the hawker center. There's some ability to transfer it to your family, but you can't really transfer it to other people. So essentially there's like certain kind of roadblocks or policy blocks that keep much older people working for a very long period of time, because there's no real social safety net or financial safety net for them to ever kind of retire gracefully out of being a hawker. And that's obviously not true for every hawker. Some hawkers have really hit success, and some hawkers have franchised and they become corporations that then can, get more government funding. But many hawkers are still single stall, like still kind of, paycheck to paycheck, still trying to make ends meet in an increasingly expensive, increasingly volatile kind of environment, and not receiving a lot of support that they need. So I think just being able to talk to some of the hawkers about like their retirement plans have been very eye-opening, not always in a good way. One uncle said to me, he's not going to retire. I asked like, oh, when are you going to retire, uncle? He's been at it for 44 years. And he's like, oh, look around. Whenever there's someone who retires or shuts down their hawker stall, within 3 weeks they're dead. And I was like, wow, okay, so his retirement plan was to die? Like, I don't think that's what we want for our elderly folks that have not only given us so much, but also not contribute a very, very perhaps intangible, but a very real part of the Singaporean experience and the Singaporean identity. So that's a whole problem. There's, of course, the problem of constantly rising costs, constantly rising like real estate, food costs, all of that, which is very difficult when there's not any real way for a single unit hawker to negotiate down a volume discount for their food, because they're not just buying that much of anything, right? It's much easier for if you're a multi-chain hotel or McDonald's to do that sort of thing, but not for like a single person, even if they had the technological know-how to do all of these things. And yet, for the most part, we see hawker foods as costing a certain amount. There's definitely a lot of kind of discontent when people raise their prices by 50 cents or $1 or whatever it is. And when I do talk to especially younger Singaporeans, how much the hawker food costs, right? They say, oh, it should cost $3.50 or $4 or whatever, $6. And I ask them, okay, like why is that? And they're like, oh, market forces. I hear that a lot. I have heard that a lot. Like, oh, it's market forces. Magically, these numbers appear.
Say that exact word, market force.
I guess the more financially minded people say market forces, or they'll say, that's the customer. That's what the customers are willing to pay. That is now true, but that isn't magically like a thing that customers like one day decided they only want to pay $3.50 for fishball noodles, right? Back in the 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s, like the government had a whole program where it was feeding people very, very subsidized lunches, dollar lunches or whatever the price translation was then, there was a whole program to offer folks that were hungry very, very, very subsidized, if not free meals. And part of the intent of those programs, the government feeding programs, was to essentially apply external pressure to private businesses to have them lower their costs as well. So restaurants started to, either if they didn't drop their price, they started giving you more for the price that they were charging you. So it created this wholesale kind of idea in the minds of Singaporeans that how much they should be paying for food is XYZ thing. And so again, these are not just prices that we fabricate, we come out of the womb and decide that we want to pay a certain amount for chicken rice. We have kind of these invisible factors that are kind of telling us, oh, it's so wrong for auntie or uncle to be charging me more because it shouldn't, be priced that way. So I think there's a lot of these like the invisible hand, right, as you would say, that are shaping our perceptions of what we should be getting at hawker centers that often we are not quite aware of and then attribute to potentially other things. There's a lot of pressure on hawkers to constantly be bending to the agendas of other wider kind of policies in the government. So for example, there's a lot of stuff around reducing your sodium intake right now. I don't know if people have seen these huge ads. There was one in Bugis, it's like massive, like your tongue can't detect the amount of salt that you're consuming, which is probably true. And all the dishes that they listed are all like hawker foods, right? Murtabak or fishball soup, or wonton mee, I think was one of them, like all these hawker foods. And so it's like, okay, wow, now we're telling the hawkers that they have to abide by certain health regulations. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be thinking about offering healthy foods, but it's like all these things that we're asking them to do. And meanwhile, let's consider what are some of the things that is branded as healthy. Milo literally has a health label on it. Look at how much sugar is in that. But Milo is owned by Nestle, and obviously Nestle has other agendas or other much more powerful influence than, auntie or uncle in the hawker stall. So you have this idea of like, oh, hawker food's so unhealthy. I've heard that from almost every single person I've talked to, including former hawkers. And I'm like, is it so unhealthy? Or is it that we have a campaign to believe it is so unhealthy? Because if we believed Milo wasn't healthy, we wouldn't serve it at all of the after-school functions, would we? But we do, right? Like, so there's just a lot of these kind of undercurrents that are going.
No, and that's awesome that you can bring it out, kind of coming out from a outsider's perspective. I want to make some time to talk about your nonprofit. Can you tell us a little bit more about what your nonprofit does and what inspired you to create one?
Yeah, so I run a nonprofit called Studio ATAO. It's spelled ATAO, stands for All Together at Once. And we do 3 kind of big branches of things. One is research. So we research things within the food industry that are problems that often are kind of at this interesting nascent stage where everyone realizes it's a problem, but nobody wants to talk about it yet, is kind of our sweet spot. So our overall mission is like, how do we help the industry define more equitable standards to be? So how do we identify issues that everyone is kind of experiencing, but perhaps don't have the vocabulary to express their oppression? That's like kind of one of the initial barriers is if you can't quite describe what you're experiencing, right? Like before we had a word for misogyny, women were experiencing misogyny. It's just that they didn't know how to explain. They were, so when you have to like explain yourself over and over again, it's very hard to kind of coalesce people around a bigger goal. So how do we help define and explain and kind of like make light, bring into the light what many marginalized folks in the industry are experiencing? So one of the things that we talked a lot about back in 2020 was tokenism, kind of this performative use of people of color, especially women of color, to kind of deflect ideas that a place isn't diverse. Like, look, we got that one Asian person, we got that one Black woman, we got that whatever, right? And that is kind of used to say, oh, we've actually changed systemically when we have not. So what tokenism looked like in food media and also like across the food industry, we talked a lot about our project after that was around gentrification and how gentrification and hospitality go hand in hand. Often when new restaurants and new bars open, that area starts to get gentrified and a lot of those neighbors start getting pushed out, and kind of like, how do we wrestle with this kind of frustration, contradiction of wanting small businesses, but also knowing that the prevalence of them makes a neighborhood more attractive for developers, which then ends up edging out not only those businesses, but the people who are supporting them. So that's one vertical, the research vertical. Second vertical is education. So we're building a curriculum called the Food Systems 101 curriculum. It's the first of its kind, like food systems curriculum that is actually built by food workers for food workers. So it's really for people that are in the industry as opposed to only, graduate level folks. There's a lot of food studies curriculums out there, but they're usually at, if not at undergrad level, probably at grad level. And that's just not accessible to 99% of the people that work in food. So how do we create something that is going to, appeal to the person that is actually like cooking your food or growing your food and processing your food? And then the third thing that we do is community organizing. So actually bringing together folks that work in the food system so that they can build solidarity networks and kind of advocate for the change they want in their workplaces. So we've been doing that for the last couple of years through something called the hospitality worker town halls, where we bring together hospitality workers in different cities, so Chicago, New York, LA, et cetera, and have them talk about the issues that are specific to their workplaces in those cities. Because while there's a lot of overarching problems with the hospitality industry in the States, they're also localized. They look different. All the states have slightly different laws around minimum wage or things like that. And so how do we really be effective at a local level and bring together the people that are most affected by all these legislations that are literally impacting their livelihoods, help them form coalitions and networks with one another, and put together kind of findings that kind of push their workplaces into actually implementing, writing down, publicly committing to certain values or certain goalposts that they're going to put in mind for their employees' well-being in the future.
And what inspired you to create the nonprofit?
So I have a lot of feelings about the nonprofit industrial complex and if it's good to even, can change be made through nonprofits, which is we can talk about that forever. I think yes and no would be the short answer. I think ultimately what I really wanted to do is I just wanted to create an organization that could address many of the problems that I was seeing within the food industry, being a food worker myself, and I don't know how I was meant to do that with a for-profit business. Even like a B Corp or something, we would have to do something that would then make money, like explicitly for making money. And I was like, I don't have anything to sell. I don't want that to distract us from the fact that we have a mission to do this other thing. So it felt like nonprofits were the best avenue to do that. Now, in hindsight, having run a nonprofit for many years, you're still bogged down by that stuff. You still have to make money somehow as a nonprofit. We do a lot of private DEI work, and it still drains a lot of our time, a lot of our resources, when every time we do a private workshop, I'm like, the amount of hours that I put into this, I would have very much preferred to have been actually putting into our research, our education, literally anything else except for this. So it's not that it has come without its issues, but the fact that at least people know that that's not our main focus, I think takes some of the pressure off my team.
Got it. And how can someone support your nonprofit if they're listening to this?
Yeah, you can follow us online. Check out our website, studioatao.org. And then, of course, you can donate financially. That is very helpful for us. Right now, we are focused on building out Food Systems 101. So it is an 8-module curriculum that talks about every aspect of the food system, and with a very explicit social justice focus, which I don't really think has been done before. We're not over here to say, and then some bad stuff happened in the 1600s and suddenly all these lands got colonized. How did that happen, right? We're here to talk about power dynamics. We're here to talk about some of the uncomfortable things that a lot of our history books have kind of, talked around. So if that is of interest, please support us. You can join our kind of follower network, and we're often looking for beta testers. So we really believe in making sure that when we build something, it's for the people that actually are going to use it. So instead of building in a vacuum, every time we are done with a module, we send it off to beta testers, so people who work in the food industry, our target demographic, to give us feedback, and then we go back and rework the things that they didn't like.
And is it okay if they're outside of the U.S.?
Yeah, they don't have to have prior knowledge as long as they're willing to spend time telling us all the things that they don't like or they did like, or just give us details.
That's very cool. As someone who isn't in the food industry, it's very cool to listen to someone talk about the nuances of the industry. And yeah, I think it's awesome that you created a nonprofit that you wanted to see and that you wanted to benefit from, but it just didn't exist. So you just created it for other people just because you wanted to see it in the world, right? organizations are really powerful if they have a very niche and very passionate group. And it seems like you've found that. Like a normal person outside of the industry would have never thought of these things so far. But, as someone who's in it, you're able to really empathize and create spaces that are not generic, but very specific to the people who are working and living that reality.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I really do believe that small is really, really important. To be able to do things on a small scale really matter, even though sometimes, especially when it comes to dollars, it feels like it's always about scale. It's always about reaching more people. Sometimes it's about reaching people more deeply. And I think also the organization is ultimately only as good as how well it can uphold its values internally. So if we have all these ideas, these lofty ideas of what we want to see in the food industry, then we also have to be able to do those internally. And that's something that I think starts breaking down with a lot of organization I've seen. And I don't think because of ill will or anything, it's hard to maintain a lot of these values around equity, around equal participation, about consensus building, et cetera, when you start growing bigger and bigger and start thinking only about scale. And so part of that reason is why we've stayed so small. Part of that reason is why we only work in certain cities at a time. Part of the reason is why we only target a certain demographic of people, right? Is that we feel confident in carrying out our values in those spaces, and we want to maintain that instead of prioritizing just looking more lucrative to potential buyers or something.
And if someone wanted to get started and understanding food politics, where would you direct them?
Ooh, okay, so a lot of reading. So definitely watch all of the videos that I've posted on Instagram and TikTok.
Shout out.
I guess that's more digestible. I did a 8-minute-ish lecture at Harvard last year around food politics. It's meant to be like a food politics introduction. So that's a good place to start. I think the book that I always recommend as a starting point, it is quite dense, but it is truly if you've never read this stuff, your mind will be like, it's called The Foodie's Guide to Capitalism. There is an online free PDF floating around, but you should also be able to find it easily at your local library. So I would say start there, and then definitely just start following kind of the network of food politic professors. So that professor who wrote that book is one of them. Marianne Nestle is a great one who wrote a book literally called Food Politics, as well as Soda Politics. Even more mainstream authors like Michael Pollan is good to just get a sense of a slightly softer version of food politics, but just understand what the direction and the tone that these conversations are taking now.
If you enjoyed this episode, hit a like and subscribe down below. 3 seconds from you makes a massive impact on getting more people to hear the inspiring stories and advice from our guests.